The defeat of France in 1940 against Nazi Germany and its allies is often reduced to a simple bypass of the line, imaginary, completed by the nullity of a poorly equipped French army having a war behind and whose soldiers lacked vigor in combat. However, a closer examination of the Battle of France reveals that this narrative does not hold up. We soon discover the true reason for Germany's triumph lies elsewhere. I worked on today's episode at your request. The idea is to share with you through perspectives, historians, various horizons, so not only French. The reality of several battles of May-June 1940, where the French soldier was far from the image of the Big Zero, that we were happy to stick to him, without overlooking the shortcomings of the French army. On May 10, 1940, Hitler's Germany launches an offensive with the German army entering Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg. The Allied command had anticipated and expects the main German attack to be in the Belgian plains, to enable the Wehrmacht German army to maximize the impact of its armored forces. As soon as the assault is launched, the French and British troops stationed in France due to Belgian neutrality enter Belgium in turn to take their position on the Gambloux line in accordance with the plan of General Gamelin in charge of the Allied strategy. Given the speed of the fast German armored divisions of the 16th Panzer Corps of General Hoppner, it is essential for the Allies' plan to be implemented that the German tanks are stopped in their progress. This is the challenging task assigned to General Prieu's 2nd and 3rd Light Mechanized Divisions. The first tank battle of World War II occurs near Hannut on May 12, 1940, as the two forces engage in combat. Opposing them are 380 French tanks supported by their motorized infantry regiment, which make up most of the French light mechanized divisions. To the 680 German tanks of General Hoppner's 16th Panzer Corps, also supported by several support battalions. The objective of the French is simple: to block the German army, in order to allow the French and British divisions stationed in France, due to Belgian neutrality, to take position. As per the Allied command plan, the German forces have the overall advantage. On the French side, the 380 armored vehicles of the light mechanized divisions consist of 2/3 light tanks and 1/3 medium to heavy tanks. On the German side, the majority of the 680 tanks are light, with only 150 medium to heavy tanks. To put it simply, light tanks are essentially effective against infantry or potentially other light tanks. Medium to heavy tanks can also combat other armored vehicles. In reality, the 220 tanks face the brunt of the 16th Panzer Corps' 680 armored vehicles, further worsening the already unfavorable numerical balance of forces. France now has only one tank for every 3 German tanks. However, they are backed by the French motorized infantry, which comprises most of the mechanized light divisions. Well trained and disciplined, these troops are however not equipped with either anti-tank weapons or air defense weapons. As strange as it may seem, from May 12th, German aviation effectively provides crucial ground support for the remainder of the campaign, playing a vital role in their success. Despite unfavorable conditions, the 3rd Division's light mechanized infantry holds ground perfectly, suffering heavy losses. Here, we see the early stages of the hedgehog tactic, forming infantry islands supported by artillery which are difficult to dislodge. This tactic is particularly effective against a mobile armed force, thus countering German infiltration tactics. While the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, is not really able to break the locks that these positions represent, and this despite intense bombing. One of the German colonels who fought in this battle thus shares the way I quote, "The French show admirable tenacity, not giving up despite their losses. An inch of ground made General Hoppner continue to ignore where the French armored forces were." That's precisely the point. Unable to dislodge them, the German tanks passed the hedgehogs to cut them off from the rest of the army. At that moment, the French tanks launch a counterattack. The French tanks then come to fill the gaps between the hedgehog formations and vigorously push back the German tanks while under fire from the Air Force. The French prevail and put a stop to the German advance. The fighting persists similarly the next day. While retreating towards Gambloux, where the rest of the French army is to be positioned, General Prieu's men perfectly accomplish their mission of delay. The 1st French army is in position when the Germans reach Gambloux on May 14, 1940. This tactical victory allows Prieu's men to push back the Germans, forcing them to wait for reinforcements and enabling the French to retreat. The mission is accomplished at the cost of 105 tanks and many men lost in the battle. German aviation takes out half of the losses, while Germany loses 165 tanks in the battles. These battles illustrate the quality of French equipment as much as the combativeness and capacity of French troops. But the benefits of this tactical win are negated by simultaneous events happening further south. France's fate is being decided simultaneously on the Meuse. The German army is advancing forcefully in Belgium, suggesting that this is the progression axis planned by the German command. In fact, everything is being decided in the Ardennes, southern Belgium. The attack itself is often simplified as the Germans bypassing the line even though we know the full outcome. Imaginal, what are we? Foolish for not anticipating it, but in practice, that's not what occurred. It's crucial to grasp that the Germans are bold in deploying no less than 40 divisions, including numerous armored and mechanized units. Through the difficult terrain that the Ardennes represent, this option was far from obvious and represented a major logistical challenge for the German army. Pétain deemed the Ardennes impassable in 1934. Contrary to common belief, Pétain's 1934 opinion before a Senate commission does not reflect the French command's stance in 1940, who had considered this option certainly on a smaller scale than what actually happened. The French command estimated that crossing, though improbable but not impossible with a sizable force, would take around a week, leaving plenty of time for the French army to maneuver in response to this movement. Especially since this German movement towards the Meuse was quite logically to be followed by the crossing of the Meuse. According to French command estimates, the movement would take another week. The estimates, while bold, were not entirely unreasonable. German military historian Karl-Heinz Friese's description reveals the logistical nightmare the crossing posed for the German army. A crossing which, by the way, almost turned into a fiasco on several occasions. The Ardennes terrain was illogical for the German offensive, which relied heavily on armored vehicles, as anticipated by the French command. And for a very simple reason, the Ardennes terrain is difficult and does not allow for maneuvering, making the tanks vulnerable until they have crossed the Meuse. This move, less intuitive than an attack across the Belgian plains, thus required a significant logistical performance as well as a dose of luck. However, the French estimates and anticipations are inaccurate, as just over 2 days since the offensive began on the afternoon of May 12th. The Germans have succeeded in their coup and the German vanguard is present on the banks of the Meuse, where there are only 7 second-class French divisions and therefore essentially composed of older reservists, poorly trained and under-equipped. Since they were only supposed to prevent a possible crossing of lesser magnitude, and that we would have had time to see it coming. The sector was also poorly organized. Numerous troop movements and rotations devastate the coherence of General Grandsar's 10th Army Corps, which is responsible for the area. The troops lacked the time to familiarize themselves with their position, mission and conduct joint training. Nor any training at all for that matter, since they essentially spent the previous months, the attack that we called the phony war, to do. Defensive construction works were far from complete on May 12, 1940. It was certainly a beautiful mess in the area. The main expectation from this division is to buy time, allowing the French army to mass its defense there if an attack were to be carried out now. However, when General Lafontaine, who commands the 55th Infantry Division, positioned on a vulnerable part of the device, worries about the situation. Specifically, after the German vanguard arrived on the evening of May 12, 1940, and informs his superior General Grandsart, he has retorted, I quote, "It will take the Germans weeks to mount an attack. You're safe for at least 8 days. Yet, the offensive was launched the very next day, May 13th. General Lafontaine's men are drenched by a heavy downpour from the sky. And yes, you might not have seen that one coming, since I've been droning on about tanks for a while now. However, with insufficient Allied air forces defending the sector and a lack of anti-aircraft defense, 1,500 German planes attacked the area. The French artillery, which for once was in sufficient number, is simply crushed under the bombs and silenced. The infantry suffers a similar fate as quoted by General Ruby on this subject. The gunners cease fire and hide, the infantrymen are stunned by the noise of the bombs and the whistling of planes diving to the ground. 5 hours of torment push their nerves to the limit. Once the soldiers are well scalded and certain units, particularly artillery, are put to rout by the violence of the bombardment, the offensive is led by the elite of the German army, rigorously trained and prepared for this operation. This offensive is made up of no less than 7 of the 10 armored divisions of the German army, which represents about 2,000 tanks. It's huge. Who are, moreover, under the command of particularly capable men such as the famous Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel, all accompanied by shock infantry regiments, including the Elite Großdeutschland Regiment. The engagement resembles a fight between Mike Tyson and a 10-year-old, as the difference in strength and firepower is immense. It's important to note that the French side does not consist of professional soldiers or those with a warrior's heart, but these are men just like you and me, recently mobilized and whose military training dates back several years. They have had virtually no training, nor even any preparation to withstand this type of attack since the outbreak of the war. And yet the fight will not be as caricatured as it could have been and sees the martyrdom of the reservists whose forgotten story I am going to tell you. While there is some debate over certain details, the goal is to share something appropriate with you. For the mini-documentary, I relied on French, Anglo-Saxon and German historians, including Karl-Heinz Frieser, who provides a German perspective on the events. General Lafontaine's 55th Infantry Division absorbs the shock. This Sedan-based division, under-equipped like the other 6 French Second Army divisions, finds itself receiving alone the shock of 960 tanks supported by the German Grosse Deutschland Bed Regiment mentioned a little earlier, as well as several German infantry divisions, all under intense bombardment, first led by aviation, then German artillery. The testimony of a German infantryman who was on the other side of the Meuse allows us to imagine the violence of the attack on the 55th Infantry Division. A wall of yellowish sulfur rises above the opposite bank, continuing to grow. Under the tremendous air pressure, the windows vibrate and shatter. The ground shakes, houses wobble. Well, what must it look like over there with the French? The men on the ground reacted differently. Some cracked under the relentless bombing and fled, especially among the gunners, as I mentioned a little earlier. There are also cases of shell shock. In fact, this is something we also observed during the First World War. In practice, these soldiers were psychologically broken, unable to move or react after the bombing. However, General Ruby noted that the dominant initial reaction, the men are in position but are dazed, shocked and stupefied from enduring the noise of bombs for hours. The defensive infrastructures they are in, which were not completed, are losing the little cohesion they had. Communications between units are completely cut off, while some of the bunkers are damaged. In short, it's looking pretty grim for the French, whose infantrymen seem to be holding up, however. Despite this bombardment, which German historian Karl-Heinz Frieser calls the most violent of the Western campaign. Beyond these initial losses, the bulk of the 55th Infantry Division's defense is still there when the bombardment stops. It thus repels all attempts to cross on May 13, until the Grosse Deutschland Regiment manages to find the gap in the early evening. The following day, German armored divisions try to cross, but the French resist as long as they can. Rommel himself nearly gets captured after crossing, but is saved by the arrival of his tanks. However, I need to tell you about a Zinzin affair that took place behind this battle. This is what was called the Bulsen Panic. May 13th, 1940 was a chaotic day in the sector. As mentioned earlier, the French soldiers' reactions varied. As we have seen, some units, particularly several artillery units, scattered during the bombings. But the question is, where did they go? Well, it ends up in total chaos. Around 6 post-meridium, General Lafontaine and his staff are in Bulsen, 5 miles south of Sedan. They announce that German tanks will soon arrive in the area. Arrival imaginary, as their infantry comrades at the front endure terrible hours. And they manage to prevent the crossing of the German panzer divisions, which in fact only passed the next day. But the rumor spreads like wildfire, causing a panic that will gradually extend to each unit, in turn generating orders and counter-orders, finishing off sinking the battle into nameless chaos. General Lafontaine keeps his cool, unlike a large part of the men under his command. He thus has trucks placed across the road, used by the fugitives in order to stop the rout. He gives of himself and tries to remobilize his men with the help of his staff officers. With reassuring words as much as threats uttered with his weapon in hand. Despite the general's efforts, the growing German pressure proves too much to overcome. The following day, the Germans start crossing, turning the May 13th rumor into reality. On the 14th, German tanks have now crossed the Meuse. The Germans, with their superior numbers, air support and weaponry, successfully crossed the Meuse at multiple points, dashing any hopes of a miracle on the river. Overwhelming old, disorganized and ill-prepared French devices collapse, undermined by panic. The 55th Infantry Division's resistance nodes fall one by one, attacked on their flanks or rears. The defeat is total, and the division is simply and purely destroyed, leaving many French dead on the battlefield. It is important to understand that the 55th Infantry Division was simply and purely swept away militarily by the German pressure. Bulsen's panic, triggered by the pressure, exacerbated the situation but was not its cause. It mainly slowed down and disrupted the reaction of a French command which did what it could on the ground. At other points in the battle without such an event, the situation was similar. The 102nd Fortress Infantry Division thus does what it can and holds for 2 days before being simply and purely crushed by the Germans. On May 15th, Moroccan and Algerian troops of the French Empire, led by their Hungarian officers, distinguished themselves through their bravery, prior to being entirely and brutally slaughtered in a valiant but ultimately futile clear saber charge against German fire. During these battles, the Germans have logically overturned the French device at Sedan, but not all is lost. The rumble of the French beyond tanks' tracks resonates from the heights of the Stonne Massif. The Battle of Stonne is the violent result of the first large-scale counter-offensive put in place from May 14th by the French. Who can then turn the tide of the battles? This renowned counterattack was originally meant to rally the remains of the 10th Army Corps, whose destiny and collapse we just covered. Supported by the powerful 21st Army Corps of General Jean Flavigny, among other things, it had an armored division composed of powerful heavy tanks like the famous B-1, more precisely the B-1 bis. At that moment, if used well, this force can stem a German crossing that is starting to falter due to the fatigue of the German soldiers who have hardly slept for several days. This precious time gained would allow the French command to react and plug the gap. However, this counteroffensive is off to a bad start. It's the unfortunate General Lafontaine, who can't be blamed for his commitment on the field, who is entrusted with organizing the counterattack on the side of the 10th Army Corps. While following the plan, his men battled the Germans without the support of tanks, which failed to arrive even after hours of fighting. But where have they gone? Well, the French tanks were simply not ready for the offensive, suffering both from their substantial fuel consumption and a failing logistics. They take a precious day's delay and don't have time to arrive before Lafontaine's counter-offensive is brutally thwarted. General Flavigny, furious about the delay, orders General Brocard, head of the 3rd Armored Division, to get into position regardless, stating that this is the sacrifice mission he must perform for France, to which Brocard responds tersely, "Sacrificed in name, the tanks cannot run without fuel." And it's hard to say he's wrong. Did you know that the heavy French tanks have to refuel twice to cover the 100 kilometers between Reims, their base, and Sedan? And it's simply huge when you know that an armored division needs 3 to 6 hours, depending on the context, to refuel. In summary, this initial phase is another setback that abandons numerous French troops. But the fight is not over, and the French do not give up on the counter-offensive they know to be vital. The Germans have reached the Mont Dieu Massif, south of Sedan, attempting to establish a position on the Stonne Plateau. Flavigny's efforts eventually pay off with a surprise awaiting them. On May 15, 1940, the Grossdeutschland Regiment, backed by tanks, attempts to capture Stonne, held by French infantry, marking the start of the battle. The village changes hands 4 times between 8:00 and 10:45 amid fierce fighting. At 11 anti-meridium, the French Charlottes begin their operation. 1 hour later, the elite Grossdeutschland Regiment is forced to retreat and the French recapture the village. However, during the afternoon, General Flavigny, now commanding the French counterattack, reorganizes his troops with the idea of retaking Sedan in accordance with the orders he has received, thus ordering his tanks to withdraw from Stonne. This movement mechanically opens a breach in the French device, immediately exploited by the Germans, who retake the village at 17:30. However, an hour later, the Sedan offensive is cancelled and Flavigny commands his tanks to recapture Stonne, which he had just surrendered to the Germans. This indecision leads the German historian Frieser to say that on that day, the French just missed a unique opportunity to reverse the situation. It is indeed difficult to prove him wrong, but the Battle of Stonne is far from over. The French do not admit defeat at all, and the fights only become more brutal. The next morning, the French launch a counterattack. Their heavy tanks destroy 13 German tanks and repel the accompanying infantry. They occupy the village all day and create a real carnage. On May 17th, when the Germans attempt to recapture the position, Lieutenant Domecq, commanding a tank battalion, earns the nickname Butcher of Stonne. On the evening of May 17th, the French are decisively pushed back from Stonne village as German reinforcements arrive. The battle for the Stonne Plateau and the Mont Dieu Massif continues. The brutality persists until May 25th, when they are ordered to retreat due to the collapse of the Allied device further north. The 3rd Division of Peirasse loses an estimated 50–60% of its tanks. Both sides suffer heavy losses, while the losses within the other divisions of the 21st Army Corps vary between 20% and 70% of their total strength. The German Grossdeutschland regiment sustains heavy casualties with nearly 600 of its elite troops lost in the battle. Around 40 German tanks were disabled. You requested examples highlighting the fierceness of combat and the French military's resolve during the 1940 Battle of France. And I think we were well served in this first part. This documentary could have an equally relevant sequel, which is why I called it the first part. This will let us cover battles around Dunkirk on the Somme or the incredible battles fought by the Army of the Alps. In short, your opinion is crucial. If you want us to see this together, let me know in the comments. Otherwise, we'll address another equally interesting topic that you have some clues about here. Before I go, I have a question for you. Do you know why the French, despite their fervor in battle, as we saw together today, drag around the reputation of being cowards? No, this video is made for you.